Mark is, of course, one of the great heroes of our election protection movement. This group here, we have been breaking this story for 4 years now, and we still don't have anybody in the major corporate media paying attention. But Mark has written, well, we don't have, what was Fooled Again. Fooled Again was the first one, and now he's got Lose or Take All. This one's here for $15. And Mark has just been a stalwart on this issue, as you know. He's one of the few that was able to get us any kind of attention. His first book, Fooled Again, is a great book, and it was really majorly responsible for getting Bobby Kennedy on the case. And Bobby, of course, finally got us into Rolling Stone. And so now, of course, we're confronting what we hope will not be a replay of 2004. Bob and I have a piece out on the web today urging all of America to come out and be poll workers. And, you know, here in Ohio, it pays $120 for the day. You can actually get paid to save American democracy for a day. And one of our goals in this country, in this election, is to have poll workers in every precinct in the United States who are committed to actual democracy and a fair vote count. And Victoria has told me a story how she saved, just by splitting the lines in a room that had 2 precincts, she saved hundreds of votes. And so, you know, all of us activist types, you know, face this. We always have people, oh, you guys are so great. What can I do? And they expect to get an answer for something that makes no sense or that they can't do. And what we are telling people now, be a poll worker. Be a poll judge if you can do it. Be an observer. Join the Video the Vote teams. We want a Video the Vote team at every precinct in America. So if they're going to steal this election, it will be on tape this time, and at least we'll have visuals of what they did. Now, no one has been more influential in getting us the kind of, you know, we've had scant support over the past 4 years. Still, the Democratic Party is still in hostile denial. The Republican Party is in denial, but they don't really care because they think they can do it again. But, you know, no one has been willing to cover this, and no one has done a better job of bringing it into tangible, understandable form than Mark Crispin Miller. So it's my deep honor to introduce him and give him hell. Mark, thank you very much.
Wow. Thanks. That is very moving to me. In fact, to be on the same stage with Harvey and to be here with Bob and John Ennis, a great kid, made a great movie, and to be with all of you. I mean, it's weird to be talking to a large-ish group of people on the night of a presidential debate, and you're not all fleeing for the exits. I mean, it started 7 minutes ago, so you still have a chance to go if you want to. But what's amazing about it is that, you know, in our system, that is, by the lights of our establishment, our 2 parties and the corporate media, politics is nothing but theater. That's all it is. It's spectacle. That's it. It's all the latest play that somebody made. The biggest news is so-and-so's ad or the debate style. How did it go down, right? I mean, the model for the way in which our media talks about politics is sportscasting, isn't it? I mean, it makes a certain sense that Keith Olbermann is like a star political analyst, and I guess one of the better ones, but he's a sportscaster. Rachel Maddow is a sportscaster. Chris Matthews is a sportscaster. They're all sportscasters. And on election night, what they do is they sit around doing sportscasting, right? Every single time. You get Wolf Blitzer or whoever the genius is who's in charge, and then 4 or 5 other geniuses with laptops, right? And they're all staring intently into their laptops. And then each one of them gets a chance to kind of riff on what the numbers mean. What do the numbers mean? And they go on and on about the numbers. Tell us what they mean. You know, well, white women have cut that way, and he had a weakness with so-and-so, and it was probably because of his debate. You know, this stuff is pure astrology. You know what I mean? I mean, I don't mean to offend any astrologers out there, okay? I mean, astrology's actually got more to it. But this is astrology. This is complete crap. They don't know where these numbers came from. You know, they have no idea. As far as they're concerned, the numbers are accurate. Well, how do you know? Well, they are. Well, what if the exit polls are different from the official vote count? Well, the pollsters got it wrong, right? In other words, the election numbers, the official outcome of the election is the most authoritative poll in their minds. See? And I want to say something in opposition to that idea, and it's really very good news, okay? The official outcome of our elections has nothing to do with how the candidates have done in our contest. Nothing. I mean, there's really no relation whatsoever. The tragic thing is that we have tended, enough of us have tended to believe the official numbers, so that the way we actually see ourselves and each other is affected by that seeming consensus, right? So, for example, a lot of people, liberals, people on the left, have thought now for 7 years that they're a besieged minority, right? That a majority of Americans actually buys the Bush-Cheney agenda. This is false. There's no evidence for this. There is only evidence of the opposite. Now, let me tell you one big reason why Karl Rove picked Sarah Palin to be John McCain's running mate. Because you do know that Karl Rove's running this campaign, right? I'm not doing shtick, this is a fact. The reason why Karl Rove picked Sarah Palin as John McCain's running mate is not to try to pick off disgruntled Hillary Clinton supporters. That's not the point. The reason they picked Sarah Palin is so that they could galvanize the furthest fringe of the religious right. Okay? Why do they want to do that? It is not because that fringe is sufficiently large to elect John McCain. That is not the reason. There are not enough of those people to put John McCain in the White House. There aren't. There's a very subtle distinction I'm making here now. The reason why they want to galvanize the religious right is that when they steal it this time, they can then say, oh yeah, just like last time, just like 2004, these people came out. They came out, and they of course, they re-elected George Bush, right? Millions of them suddenly materialized. And likewise, this time, they turned out. See? So the choice of Sarah Palin, which makes no sense if the Republican Party were trying to reach out to undecided and independent voters. Makes no sense, right? Because she is a complete wacko. And the spectacle of that convention was a wacko spectacle. And the platform of the party in this convention was a wacko platform. You know that the platform actually calls for a ban on privately funded stem cell research? Okay, you know who the vice chair of the platform committee was, right? It was Ken Blackwell, exactly. So it was an extremist exercise. It was actually a convention very much like, I see some gray hairs in the room, very much like the 1992 Republican convention, when Bush, Quayle made their second bid for power, and Marilyn Quayle gave this very hostile culture war speech. It was a complete disaster. It was a bust. It was too far to the right. It was too theocratic, too, Christianist. Well, that's the model they used this time. And again, I repeat, it is not to mobilize a key voting bloc. Understand, and I think the people in this room do understand, they don't care how people vote. That's not part of the equation. They don't really care. See? They want, rather, to lay down a narrative that will suffice to explain how it happened that John McCain, the worst candidate in American history, and the whitest man I've ever seen. I mean, isn't he incredibly white? It's kind of wonderful. I mean, standing next to Sarah Palin, say what you will about her, and go right ahead, say it, is at least, in the pink of health. She's ruddy. I mean, next to her, he looked like he'd been exhumed, He's just been pulled out of the grave and propped up, you know. He looks like he's been sculpted out of snow, you know. This man is so white. Anyway, his color aside, or lack of color aside, you know, they have to lay down narratives. They have to lay down pre-propaganda, see? And one crucial narrative is the Christians came out again, okay? Like they did last time. Oh, the New York Times said, after the night she gave her maiden speech at the convention, they actually said on the front page that this will shore up McCain's social conservative base and conceivably help him win the way they helped Bush win in Southern Ohio in 2004. Okay, I mean, do I have to go through with all of you the evidence against this notion that there was a Christian surge in 2004? Because, I mean, you know, there's a great essay, Loser Take All. I edited this book. It's a collection of essays. Bob Petrakis has an essay in here. Brad Friedman has a great essay in here. Steve Rosenfeld has an essay. And there's a great essay by Michael Collins called The Urban Legend. And he goes through, you know, the demographics of the 2004 election. The rural vote in 2004 went down by 7 points, and Bush got 2 million fewer votes than he had 4 years before. Huh, that's funny. I thought a lot of Christian evangelicals lived in the rural areas. Now, the small town vote went way up, but Kerry and Bush divided it equally. See? Pew did its usual post-election poll, and they asked people, what made you vote the way you did, right? Do you know how many people said moral values? 9%. You know how many people said gay marriage? Because the big meme, you know, the talking point was, it was those homos getting married. That's what got people out to vote Bush back into office. You know how many people said that that was the make or break issue for them? 3%. 3%. Okay? I mean, I could go on. Indeed, I have gone on. The fact is there's no evidence that there was any Christian surge in 2004, but it did the trick. Okay? It took. The media were all repeating this. Why? Because they will pick up any theory, however crack-brained and groundless it may be, as long as it absolves them from having to entertain the possibility that the election was stolen. That doesn't happen. That's crazy. That's conspiracy theory. See? Better we should believe that Hillary cried, and that's why she won the New Hampshire primary. Remember this? She was on life support. I mean, metaphorically speaking. Campaign was finished. The polls showed she was dead and buried. Nobody was going to her rallies. Okay, everybody was going to Barack Obama's rallies. Nobody was going to hers. She wins. Okay, now, some of you may know that as it turned out, Barack Obama actually won the hand-counted vote in New Hampshire. Okay, 16% of the votes in New Hampshire are hand-counted. Barack Obama won the hand-counted vote by over 6 points. The other 84% of the vote is counted by optical scanner, and that Hillary won by like 5.5 points. LHS Associates, the private company that programs the machines, and then Dory Smith, a radio reporter in Connecticut, reports, and no one bothers to repeat, the fact that in the week before the election, LHS Associate employees were just showing up at town clerks' offices throughout the state and saying, oh, we just want to make sure your machines work right, so we're going to make some adjustments. So they didn't have any trouble with their machines on election day, okay? No questions yet. I'm on a roll now. I've been in an airplane all day, and if I stop to answer your question, I'll forget where I was, okay? Okay. In fact, I already did forget where I was. Yeah. So better to say that Hillary cried, oh, and found her voice. That was on the cover of Newsweek. I found my voice. That makes sense. See, she bursts into tears. Everybody decides to vote for her. That makes sense. But the evidence that the Republicans had manipulated the machinery in order to bring her campaign back to life because they wanted to run against her. See? That we can't think about. That's impossible. That can't happen. See? So, the theory that the Christians will all have come out to vote for McCain-Palin is one narrative that if they succeed in stealing this election, we will hear plenty. Okay? We will also hear that America will not vote for a black man. Okay? We'll hear that, yeah, it's something called the Bradley effect. They poll well, black candidates poll well, but when they go into the voting booth, white voters will, listen to the inner Klansman. Okay? Now, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, okay? But I'm saying it is a theory, it is unverifiable, there is no evidence to support it, it's just a guess. Okay? There's plenty of contrary evidence that Barack Obama actually appeals to a lot of people who might not otherwise vote for a black candidate. But the most important point is there is copious and specific evidence of vote suppression and election fraud by the Republican Party. That's not theoretical, not a guess, not a speculation. We know it's going on. See? But it's safer to say, well, it's racists. It's racists. We don't know how many. In the sanctity of the voting booth, they become racists or they act on their racism. And we'll hear, well, Barack Obama lost because he didn't pick Hillary as his running mate. We hear a lot of theories. We'll also hear from George Lakoff that Barack Obama lost because he didn't frame things right. He didn't frame things right. We'll hear from Tom Frank that Barack Obama lost because those hicks, those bumpkins out there in Kansas, still don't know what's good for them. They're so dumb, not like Tom Frank, much smarter than they are, even though he's from Kansas too. You get my drift? Michael Moore will say, Obama lost because he didn't listen to me. I mean, that's his claim about 2004. Michael Moore says Bush won the election because Kerry and the Democrats didn't listen to me. If they'd listened to me, he would have won. It's similar to the argument that comes from The Nation. If Kerry had just run more left, he would have won. See? Meanwhile, you've got right-wing Democrats, Democratic Leadership Council types saying Kerry lost because he ran too populist a campaign. So what I'm suggesting to you is that how people explain away an unlikely victory has everything to do with their politics, their own politics, and their pet theories, So they become branded as having a certain kind of theory, whether it's framing or what's the matter with Kansas, and then they continue to explain everything in those terms, okay? Now, it's the hardest, really very hard, I was going to say the hardest thing in the world. That's an exaggeration. But it's very, very hard to try to take a larger view of what's going down. Because if people are happy with the results of an election, they will not want to hear this kind of thing. They just won't. So you got a lot of Republicans, not as many as formerly, but a lot of Republicans bristle when you suggest that Bush stole his elections. They get furious because they were basically happy with the result. And they call it nutball theories, tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theory, and so on. They're perfectly willing to subscribe to, theories about Democrats stealing elections, right? But one of their own, no, that doesn't happen. We don't do that, see? Similarly, the Democrats, after the 2006 election, were as happy could be because they were allowed to claim 29 victories, right? So Chuck Schumer and Rahm Emanuel are basking in the glow of media praise. These are the architects of the great victory. They did it right. They hit one out of the park, right? It's never the voters who deserve credit. It's always these architects, right? So they didn't want to talk about the fact that they probably won 50 seats in 2006, not 29. The Republicans had given themselves a 4-point advantage through the memory cards, and it turned out not to be enough. See? Because interestingly enough, the corporate media, the last week of the campaign, came out with one devastating story after another, And if you look at the contributions from the parent companies and from Wall Street in that election cycle, they were backing the Democrats then, Democrats got far more money in campaign contributions in 2006 than Republicans did, see? So the fact is, we have to do what I think the people in this room are trying to do, which is place the strongest emphasis not just on the fortunes of one political party or of one particular candidate, however much we may like them. It's not about that. It's about democracy. It's about voting rights. It's about popular self-government. See? It's about the people's right to vote, which is sacrosanct. A lot of people, not as many as formerly, but many people on the left continue to think that this issue is just one of many. It's just another issue. It's very important, but there's a lot of issues that are important, and this is one of them. Okay? That's not true. I don't really care what a person's major issue is. It could be the war. It could be economic justice. It could be reproductive freedom. It could be racial justice. It could be Darfur. It could be the whales. It could be nuclear energy. I don't care what it is. If we don't have the right, the power to choose our representatives and to get rid of them when we don't want them to represent us any longer, we will make progress on no other front. It's impossible, okay? If you don't have that, you don't have anything. You're a slave. You're a slave, okay? Tom Paine said the right to vote is the basis on which all our other rights depend, and he was right. And I don't care, you could have Che Guevara on your T-shirt. You can engage in all kinds of cultural radicalism. You can sign 1 million petitions. You can email all your friends till you're blue in the face. But if you don't have the power of voting, okay, you're screwed. And that's a fact. It's as simple as that. And as complicated as that. I think you all know what I'm saying. Now, the fact that it is so vitally important makes it intolerable that to this day, the press continues to deny what's been going on and what's going on now. And I don't just mean the corporate press, I mean the left press too. Where are they? Where's The Nation? Where's Mother Jones? These are all the outlets that came out after the 2004 election and basically argued, no, Ohio wasn't stolen. Well, how do you know that? Oh, I went and I talked to a Democrat there. Okay, that's powerful evidence, I admit. But the fact is, we knew then that it was stolen. Now we know beyond any shadow of a doubt, thanks to Richard Hayes Phillips' book, Witness to a Crime, thanks to the revelations of Stephen Spoonemore, which I reckon you all know about, whose expert testimony is driving this very important lawsuit that could make all the difference. The fact is that still the press will not talk about it. In the latest issue of Newsweek, there's an article. I mean, it really makes you feel as if you're living in a bizarro universe to read these things. There's an opinion piece by somebody named Jonathan Darman, maybe related to Dick Darman, I don't know, who says, the headline is, Why Democrats Lose Elections, okay? And you want to know the reason why Democrats lose elections, according to Newsweek? Because this is a center-right country. This is a country whose population is center-right. What do you say to that? How do you even begin to answer that? I mean, leaving aside the issue of the abundant evidence that the elections have been stolen, how about all the statistical evidence that this is not a center-right country, right? I mean, issue after issue. Social security, minimum wage, global warming, single-payer health insurance, reproductive freedom, the war. You go on and on and on down the list of issues. Most of the population is actually on the progressive side. See? And I think that here we begin to understand why the corporate press in particular doesn't really want to go there. Because the corporate press is part of this hermetic world of the establishment, that they don't want to face up to what people really want, and they don't want people trying to assert their voting rights, because in fact that's too left-wing. That's just too far to the left, it's too threatening. See? So, Barack Obama doesn't talk about this issue, right? Most Democrats don't talk. A few do, most don't. Now, let me basically sum up what I've said so far by saying that this is actually as frustrating as it is and as infuriating as it often is, this press silence. It's actually, what I'm telling you is good news, see? Because we never elected any of these people, okay? We didn't elect Bush either time, and it wasn't close in 2004, okay? The more evidence comes to light, the clearer it becomes that Kerry won easily by 5 million votes, maybe twice that many, okay? That's one point. Secondly, here's some more good news. Most people either know or intuit that something's really wrong with our elections. This is not something that the mass of people can't handle, Often I have friends say, well, people, they're in denial, they can't, it's too scary to them. No, it's people in the establishment who are in denial, right? It's leading Democrats who are in denial. It's the press that's in denial. It's not most people. I mean, I, like a lot of other people in this room, have been speaking on this thing for 4 years to audiences of all kinds, all over the country, not just diehards like you guys, right? And people either get it or suspect it. See? So the task we have before us is to verify people's suspicions with specific information. And that's where the media comes in. And I don't mean CBS and NBC and the New York Times, because they're kind of hopeless. I'm talking about African American radio, churches, independent radio stations all over the country, unions. I mean, there are ways to spread the word. And the word has been spread. It's spread laterally. It's spread very quietly. It's often the basis of face-to-face individual conversations, as well as occasions like this. People, believe me, people can accept the fact that this regime would steal an election. In fact, more good news, these people wouldn't be in power if it weren't for election fraud. See? Because their agenda is so extreme that they could never, ever win an election legitimately in this country. Never. They never could do it. They have to cheat. They have to engage in vote suppression on a massive scale. They have to manipulate the voting machines. They have to dominate the media. They have to have a Supreme Court that's in their pocket. They have to have all this stuff because what they're trying to do is enormous. It's no mean feat to steal an election in a country of this size when your views are really foreign to most Americans. 4 months after the 2004 election, just 4 months later, Bush won 11.5 million more votes than he got in 2000. Isn't that amazing? Disapproval ratings in the mid to high 40s, and somehow he got almost 12 million more votes than he got in 2000. It was all those Christians, right? I mean, they came pouring out of covering the horizon. Lo, there they were, as far as the eye could see, Christians. Late in the day, too. Late in the day. 5 o'clock. There they all were. Millions. Like Jesus' loaves and fishes. There they were. Now, I did just lose the thread of what I was saying. Where was I going with this when I... Good news. This all sounds familiar. Not a legitimate government. Yeah, thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you and good night. Yeah, 12 million votes. Oh, I know. I got it. Thank you. I'm back on track. Don't say anything else. So everybody marveled at this, 12 million votes and Christians and, blah, blah, blah. Now, 4 months later, the Terry Schiavo episode. Remember this? 4 months later, the Terry Schiavo. 4 months after this incredible victory, thanks to the values voters, right? 4 months later, Bush and Tom DeLay and the Republicans in Congress, make this big show of forcing the feeding tube back into this dead woman's throat against the wishes of her husband, right? This is a victory for the values voters. Do you remember the mass reaction to this? Do you remember this? According to every poll, like 20% of the country thought this was a good idea. And everybody else said, this is horrible, this is terrible, they shouldn't be doing this, a private... You know, I think that was probably a more accurate reflection of what really happened on Election Day in 2004, you know, than the official numbers in that race, okay? So the news is really very good. We don't have to feel besieged and outnumbered like we're living in an alien country anymore. This is our country, see? We've been in the right all along here, and we can take it back. And I'm talking, you know, this crosses party lines. It really does, you know? It's our country. The only thing that has to happen now, and it's a huge step, is that people have to know that they know that this is their country. Follow me? Because so far, what people think is, well, you know, I know a lot of people who couldn't vote that day. I've heard a lot about this. Or maybe they'll say, I couldn't vote that day, because an awful lot of people couldn't. Everybody I know in my whole town, they all got carry signs on their front lawns. This is sometimes, you know, this is in so-called Reagan Democrat neighborhoods as well, by the way. You know, I mean, this cut across racial lines even then. But they say, you know, well, I don't hear anything about it, so it must just be me. See? That's how tyranny often works. It must just be me. I'm against this, and I don't know anybody who goes along with it. It must just be my circle. I better keep my mouth shut because I'll get in trouble. Because clearly, everybody in the media is saying, they won, he won huge, he got political capital, he's going to keep doing what he's been doing, you know? So I better be quiet. See? So the truth here is really pretty devastating. See? Now, let's talk about this election, all right? And let there be no mistake, you know, we're in a very scary situation right now. Okay? It's scary for precisely the reasons I've just outlined. These guys have a lot to lose. Okay? Let's understand, this regime, this is a criminal regime. All right? These aren't conservatives. You know, before the 2004 election, a lot of prominent Republicans came out publicly and said, don't vote for Bush again, he's not a conservative. Now, conservatives believe in limited government, fiscal prudence. There's nothing conservative about Bush-Cheney. You know? I mean, they're massively expanding the police powers of the government, shredding habeas corpus, creating a police state, spending like drunken sailors. They're not conservatives. John Eisenhower said it, Bob Barr said it, Francis Fukuyama said it, General Mike McConnell, who had been a veteran for Bush in 2000 and was Chief of Staff of the Air Force, said it. Reagan's chairman of the Joint Chiefs, William Crowe, said it. 60 newspapers in red states that had endorsed Bush in 2000 now refused to endorse him in 2004. American Conservative Magazine, Pat Buchanan's magazine, ran 5 separate endorsements. One was for Bush. See? So, I mean, it wasn't as if only Democrats got the point. A lot of Republicans got the point too, see? So, you know, they got a lot to lose. This is catching up with them just as surely as our, you know, economic excesses, or I should say their economic excesses, are catching up with all of us, right? You can't do this kind of thing forever. It can't go on. They can't afford to go gently into that good night. So I will be the most surprised guy in the deck if Barack Obama, A, wins and B, is allowed to prevail. I'll be quite surprised, because they have a lot to lose. Now, that's why they're planning to steal this election. I'm not saying they can do it. I'm saying they're planning to do it. Every day brings half a dozen to a dozen new reports all over the country of various scams that are being run to shrink the electorate still further, right? That's step one of election theft, is vote suppression, see? And it's going on all over the country. Barack Obama has filed suit against one Republican outfit that I know of in Michigan, the ones who are trying to, you know, disenfranchise people whose houses have been lost because of foreclosed mortgages. And God bless them for suing over that, but that's like one thing out of 60 or 70. So step one is to shrink the electorate, right? And you do that by using parts of the government that 30 years ago were dedicated to expanding the franchise. Department of Justice and the Supreme Court, right? Under the stimulus of the civil rights movement, those huge entities of this government actually did a great deal of good to expand the franchise. It was never bigger than it was between the 50s and the early 70s. That's a historical fact. Now the Supreme Court and the Department of Justice are working to shrink the electorate, right? If they prosecute any kind of election fraud, it's Democrats they prosecute. They are purging Democrats from voters' rolls. They are pressuring states into refusing to accept provisional ballots. They are pressuring states into putting limitations on registration drives. They are pressuring states into making their registration drives vulnerable to partisan challenges. They are working as hard as they possibly can to shrink the electorate and make it as small as possible. That's step one, okay? Step two is, what do you do with the votes that are cast, right? Well, you just do something with the memory cards and the central vote tabulators, right? You do whatever you can do cybernetically, electronically, to flip those numbers. Laugh off the exit polls, do whatever you have to do. They're working on all of this. And Stephen Spoonermore has told us. He knows who's at work here. He knows the people behind this. He knows what they're up to. He understands the devices they're using. He actually has predicted specifically that they plan to win by 51.8% of the popular vote, and with 3 electoral votes. You know, this is like an election in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, you know. We already know. Okay? Now, this is stuff that we can fight, see? We can fight this, first of all, by making sure the turnout is as large as possible on Election Day, because the higher the turnout, the harder it is to steal an election. You know, the turnout in 2006, John Ennis will tell you, it was enormous. It was the biggest off-year turnout since 1970. And that's, you know, when they talk about turnout, understand, they're talking about the votes that did get cast. See, the turnout figures should all be revised upwards, because there are more and more people who show up to vote and are told, you're not registered, get lost. See? Those numbers have been climbing and climbing. So, you know, we're always deprecating ourselves because we're so apathetic because our turnout numbers are so low. Well, they're not that low. See? We have to make some radical revisions in how we see ourselves. So we got to make sure the turnout is high. We got to monitor this election as carefully as possible. We have to get poll workers all over the country, as Harvey said. We have to have video the vote operating religiously, so to speak, with their video cameras, getting testimony from people who've been disenfranchised, putting it up on YouTube, okay? We have to do all that. At this moment, we have to do all that we can do to make sure, however we might do it, that Stephen Spoonermore's revelations get a wider hearing, you know, and that the perpetrators of the fraud get deposed by the lawyers here in Ohio, and those depositions get out there. That's got to happen, okay? That's absolutely crucial. But the most important thing is that we have to make a psychological adjustment. We have to realize that this time the struggle may actually begin on Election Day, okay? The struggle may begin on Election Day, not end then. Everybody's going to be really tired, you know. You just make it across the finish line, you're exhausted, you think, oh, geez, whatever the result, I got to rest. You know, I'm afraid that's not going to be possible. I mean, maybe it will be. I don't mean to overstate the case. But the fight's going to start then, I predict. And we, you know, somehow Obama has to be persuaded not to concede if there's an upset. Cannot do what Kerry did, right? But there's a few more facts that I'm just going to mention at the risk of scaring you. You may know them already. But, you know, we're not going to survive if we don't go into this thing with our eyes wide open, okay? This is not your average executive branch. This is not your normal American government. Well, they're much closer to fascism than they are to anything in American political experience. They're much closer to fascism. And they have a lot to lose, okay? So between now and Election Day, any number of things could happen, especially as Obama's lead continues to widen, see, and they become more and more desperate. Remember now, again, they don't care how people vote. Isn't it obvious? I mean, have you ever seen a presidency so brazen in its defiance of public opinion? Have you ever seen a president and vice president who just do this all the time? No, seriously. You know, Martha Raddatz says to Cheney, well, the American people don't seem to like the idea of this warrior preparing. Remember what he said? So? What? Who acts like that? Only people who think, hey, I got a lock on this. I'm a made man. You know? We got the election thing covered. See? I think the same's the case with McPalin, you know? Because they're, you know, they say, well, you know, maybe we'll let her talk to the press, maybe we won't, you know? It's up to us, it's not up to you. You know, if she's not going to, see what I mean? It's very strange. So, you do know that the 1st Brigade Combat Team of the 3rd Infantry, how many of you know this? Yes. Just a few, okay. This is amazing. And this is from the Army Times, see? This is not from, you know, Mr. Crackpot's website. This is from the Army Times. The 1st Brigade Combat Team of the 3rd Infantry, which has been in Iraq for 35 months conducting house-to-house searches, is coming here on Wednesday to patrol the United States. What? Well, you may say what? Because this is a direct violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. It was passed after the Civil War. You don't use the military to conduct law enforcement operations. You don't do that in the United States of America. Well, they're doing it. And the Peace and Army Times said they will be tasked with helping out with civic unrest, crowd control, or in the event of a terrorist attack, helping with that. Well, why now? Why all of a sudden are you bringing the Army over here now? See? 2 years ago, Congress passed and Bush signed, over the strenuous objections of the nation's governors, the National Defense Authorization Act. Okay? You can Google search all this. And that law gave Bush a free hand with the nation's National Guard units. So, in other words, the National Guard of Alabama, you know, is no longer responsive ultimately to the governor of Alabama. He's responsive to the president. Which means that the president can now order National Guard troops from, say, Mississippi or Alabama to a place like Columbus, you know, see, in the event that there's some kind of fuss after a funny election or questionable election, or even if there is no fuss, you know. I mean, if you don't have a fuss, you invent a fuss. You know what I mean? I mean, these are all the oldest tricks in the book, so it's not that outrageous unless you happen to think it can't happen here. All right, let me just conclude by making a point about that myth. Can't happen here. That assumption is basically what prevents all these establishment types from seeing what's happening. You know, you could scream it in their ears, they can't hear you because it can't happen here. Okay? It's an old idea. You know, Sinclair Lewis's novel, Can't Happen Here, came out in 1935. So probably throughout the 20th century, it was just an assumption that Americans held it can't happen here. We're not a banana republic. We don't have tanks in the streets. You know, we're law-abiding and our system works. Understand, okay, that it can happen anywhere, and the framers of the Constitution knew that. See, they knew that it can happen anywhere. They'd studied the history of Greek democracy. They'd studied the history of the Roman Republic. They understood that if power is permitted to gather in any one set of hands, it will destroy everybody's freedom. They got that. They understood that. That's why they set up a system of checks and balances, to prevent that from happening. So if you went back in time and said to, you know, Thomas Jefferson with great confidence, well, that can't happen here, he would have laughed in your face. Well, he wasn't that merry a guy. He would have looked astonished that you could be so dumb and so dangerously naive as to think that the nature of power has somehow changed on this particular landmass since the founding of the Republic. It can always happen, see? And ultimately, ultimately can't depend on the Democratic Party to save us from this. That seems extremely unlikely. Can't depend on the media to save us, because this media system bears no relation to the press that was around at the time of our revolution. You know, back then they didn't have news organizations, they didn't have accredited journalists, they didn't have embedded reporters, you know. They had people who owned printing presses. The freedom of the press, the freedom of the people to express their views and to agitate politically. That's what we're all doing, okay? So when they wrote the First Amendment, they actually had people rather like us in mind, see, and not people like Chris Matthews, see? So we can't depend on the press, we can't depend on the Democratic Party, we can depend on each other, you know? We can depend on John Ennis, we can depend on Bob Petrakis and Harvey Wasserman, we can depend on ourselves, see? It may seem absolutely impossible to imagine going up against a power so vast, right? It may seem utopian, crazy. But, you know, believe it or not, when this nation declared its independence from the largest military power in the world, that seemed impossible too. And at one point, it seemed impossible that the slaves could be emancipated and could actually become voting freedmen. That seemed unimaginable. It seemed unimaginable that women, chattels, household chattels, that they could be allowed to vote. All these things seemed unimaginable, see? So does this. But we have to imagine it, and we have to do it. We really have no choice. Thank you.